Right. So I think it's changed the time. It's actually good afternoon rather than good evening. Right now, it's still bright where I am. So welcome to session number 7 of Rebellious Research, the seminar dedicated to practice research in creative arts. I'm absolutely delighted to have with me today two guests, Sophie Hope from Birkbeck and Joe Coleman from Brunel University. It's a very, very emotional moment for me because I remember when I was a PhD student, I was actually attending a Corkscrew group dedicated to practice research, which Sophie was running at the time. And here I am years later inviting Sophie to my own seminar. So thank you so much, both of you, for accepting my invitation. So what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I will kindly ask the two of you to briefly introduce yourselves, and then next hour is yours. And then, of course, we're going to have Q&A sessions towards the end.
Great, thank you, Agatha. Hello everyone. I'm Sophie Hope, and I currently work at Birkbeck for the next few months. And it's nice to see you. Nice to see some new faces and some familiar faces too. So my practice-based research is in socially engaged art and politics, cultural policy, cultural labour. And we're not really going to talk about what Joe and I do in our own practices today. So that's for another time, but you can look us up. But yeah, we're going to focus on some work that Joe and I have been doing together today. So Joe, do you want to introduce yourself before I share the screen?
Yeah, thank you. So as with Agatha, I encountered Sophie through Corkscrew when I was doing my PhD at Birkbeck, and Sophie was my unofficial third supervisor because I was using my practice as a radio producer in my PhD. I am currently teaching media and public relations at Brunel University, just on the master's course, and I've been fortunate to have been able to work with Sophie on this project and one or two other post PhD workshops for Birkbeck students as well.
And I should say maybe as well to flag up Corkscrew, we'll put a link in the chat at some point about how to join that mailing list as well. But that's been a real source of support for me and for other practitioners, researchers at Birkbeck and beyond. It's open to anyone, and it's a bit of a sort of self-help group as well as a chance to show and tell really specific parts of your practice and research that you want some feedback on. And we run seminars and things, and hopefully next term I'm planning something on methods of analysis within practice-based research. So I'll circulate that certainly to Agatha to send around as well. So right, I'm going to share my screen before I forget to do that. And this research has come out of the conversations that Joe and I have been having through Corkscrew with other colleagues as well, PhD students and staff. Sorry, trying to do too many things at once. So here we go. Need to go back to the beginning. Apologies. So, that's going backwards. Oh yes, first of all, what we were going to do, and of course now I can't see the screen, so Joe, maybe you can witness a sort of show of hands or get a sense of who's in the room.
Okay.
Shall I? Yeah. So what we were going to find out is who's here, because the focus of our work has been on what happens to people after they've done a PhD. Through or as practice, or this practice-based or led in some way. So what happens into the kind of the aftermath of that? What career trajectories do people go on to? And we want to share some of the research we've done into that, but also have a chance to talk to you about what your experiences have been, what you're anticipating, what your concerns are. So first question was, I don't know how we tally this, Joe, if there is, because we can't see everyone it's not like Zoom where you can see people's windows.
I can see if people like put their hands up or give
Okay.
us a thumbs up or something.
So the first one was, who in the room is currently doing a practice-based PhD?
Right, so I've got, oh, this is great. So far I've got Linda, Francisco, Erin, Inga, Elizabeth, anyone else doing practice-based? Simon, Joe. Okay, that's 7.
How many have we got in the room in
total? Down to 6 again. No, 7. I think it was 7 out of 13.
7 out of 13. And then the next question is, so of the remaining people who finished their PhDs by I mean, again, this is a question because not everyone will have necessarily done a PhD, but for those of you who have and have finished, who in the room is working in academia the majority of the time?
So we have Agatha, Judith, Hannah, Isabel. Anyone else working in academia at all? Okay, just 4 people.
4. And then the final one is, I mean, I'm sure there are lots of other ways of, figuring out who's in the room, but the other question we had was, for those of you who've done a practice-based led PhD, who of you in the room are not working in academia? No one. We're all academicized. Have I got no hands?
No, Judith has her hand up.
So maybe there's some people are working 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Hello, Judith. Yeah, is there maybe there's a, I think that's something we've certainly found. Of course, it's not going to be one thing or the other. People are on a lot of the things we were talking to people about was the precarious nature of the sector, of course. Thank you for that. So we've done our kind of introductions to who's who. Now we're going to talk a bit about our this research we did, which started off as a podcast series and then developed into a paper, an article, which is freely available online. The link is there. Maybe we could put the link in the chat as well later, so you can just have a read of that at your leisure. And then we're going to go on to share experiences, concerns, questions that you have, and also, yeah, maybe some suggestions as well as to ways forward with all of this, and how we might create some spaces together to support each other. So the questions that I mean, is it you now, Jo? You're over to you.
Yeah, whatever.
I'm going to hand over to you to introduce our research questions.
So our research questions, when we started to think how we could turn this wonderful collection of interviews into an academic article, were what impact does doing this type of PhD have on us as practitioners? So bearing in mind that we were looking at artists and other creative people undergoing this kind of training, how did it impact their identities? And then the second research question, which we were hoping we might find answers to, was what support structures, resources, and other environmental factors would be desirable to actually help with our practice. Next slide, please. The methodology broadly was that we declared that we were taking this qualitative perspective from a non-positivist point of view. So ideally, we kind of didn't have any fixed ideas in our heads as to what we would find when we were exploring the experiences of our participants. Because we were very much in the middle of this, and particularly Sophie, because Sophie was conducting the interviews, and actually more so because they were podcast conversations, Sophie was taking part in these conversations that were turned into podcasts. We had to have this reflexive element as well, and acknowledge that it was subjective research for us as well as our participants. We were analysing the material in an iterative way. So we transcribed the interviews from the recordings and we read them, as you can see from the quote below. And we just kept sort of going round in circles for, I don't know how long, 2 or 3 months probably, and regularly checking in. And then we would go back to our main theoretical stakes in the ground, if you like, which we'll cover later, to try and just come up with some central themes that we could then use to continue our thoughts and try and come up with some evidence that would stand up as our findings.
Jo, can I just interrupt a minute? Because
Yes.
I think as well, we forgot to say that we interviewed, was it 14 or 15 people? And we in our kind of process of thinking, I mean, we still have a massive long list of people we'd love to talk to about this.
Yeah.
But we tried to kind of interview people across different generations. So I think the earliest year of graduation, if you like, from a practice-based PhD was 1992. That was Anne Douglas. We interviewed Anne, didn't we? And she was of the people we had sort of managed to get interviews with. She was the person who graduated the earliest.
That's right.
Up until, I mean, it was maybe 2020. 2020, yeah, because we did some interviews were done in 2018 and some were done in 2021 for the podcast. Then we created this podcast out of them, and also we wanted to get a cross section of types of work and types of practice but again, always loads of gaps, and not by no means kind of comprehensive, but we tried to kind of talk to people from like creative writing, film, radio, visual arts, sculpture. Yeah, we had a kind of whole, I think, quite a range of types of practice. Yeah, just I think that's worth mentioning, isn't it? The structure of
definitely. So so we very much were trying to look at podcasting as a research method. We had 2 main citations that inspired us for this, but one of the main differences in the type of interview as part of the qualitative research gathering process, as I mentioned earlier, was because Sophie was engaging in a conversation with our participants, then she was also coming up with her own experiences and articulating thoughts and ideas. So it does seem that if you're going to be recording research interviews with a view to podcasting them, that the parameters are different enough for it to actually stand alone. So it's not the same as interviewing people for your research. There's this difference because you're knowingly going into this process because it's going to be a podcast conversation. So yeah.
And I think as well, I don't know if maybe there's some other people here using, doing podcasts as their, for all sorts of different reasons. But I've done a lot of, I tend to end up doing podcasts quite a lot with all the different projects we've done. I've got quite a few on the go, and I find them like my way of justifying it to myself and thinking it through is that they feel like public sketchbooks or thinking aloud type processes, which I know is not for everyone, and that was like worst case scenario for a lot of people. But for me, I quite like sort of the behind the scenes thinking processes, the messiness, as Jo found out, I'm not very slick and organized with these things. So I think there's a sort of work in progressness to them, which is somebody experienced more in radio producing and things probably was quite uncomfortable for Jo at times because she was doing all the editing, thinking this is not professional enough. But yeah, there's this, I quite, there's that idea of bringing different people together to talk through things and think out loud, which I just really appreciate that process. But I'm aware that it is a growing area of thinking, and now I'm developing podcasts as a research method. So it feels like we've sort of been doing that, and hopefully other people will find that useful to reflect on as well and think how to do things or not in their own processes of research. Sorry, Jo, I'll go on to the next.
No, this is how we work, isn't it? Two-handed.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. So so again, just continuing the self-reflexive aspect, the subjectivity. This was just an example. I took the screenshot of the season 1 roundup, and by the look of that, it means that there's supposed to be a season 2 coming. But anyway, we won't worry about that. But what I wanted to do was ask people just to listen to the first part of the interview, and you'll hear Sophie in conversation, but actually thinking through her thoughts.
Welcome to the Corkscrew podcast on practice research beyond the PhD. Your host is Dr. Sophie Hope, a practice-based researcher in the Film, Media and Cultural Studies Department at Birkbeck, University of London.
Why would anyone do a PhD? Why would an artist do a PhD when there are particular frameworks and definitions of research? The PhD will be judged as a piece of research, whether it's arts informed or based or practice led or whatever. And unless you're willing to kind of go down that journey and become a researcher through that process, then it's perhaps not worth the risk going through all that effort of doing the PhD. But because my own experience, and I see it in other people's work, is that it changes your practice, it changes your relationship to practice, and it's not to say that you can't revert back to this work, but you will be a changed person, and your practice will be changed because it will have gone through this kind of reconfiguring and rethinking through having to identify and experience the relationship to knowledge. And again, that is a philosophical inquiry, essentially, or you're developing a philosophical relationship to knowledge and how we know things. And so, and not all artists or practices need to go through that process, or like, I don't know, like there's a sort of becomes institutionalized or something, or academicized through certain checks and balances. But at the same time, I'm very interested in methodology and how methodologies themselves are fluid and often quite movable feasts when it comes to practice research. But the process of justifying and clarifying how and why you've gone about certain things is part of that journey as well. So I guess I'm sort of torn between that, like, yes, we need to explain what we're doing, but we also need to kind of keep things open for them to morph and change.
I think art schools themselves are still resisting the notion of research.
Professor Anne Douglas is Research Professor at Gray's School of Art, the Robert Gordon University.
The default position is back into this idea of arts and crafts, that it's the techne of art practice that is the important thing. And really, I'm not, well, in my experience, not so clear on how art schools are learning from what I think is the big change in artistic practice, or particularly in the visual arts. I mean, and I, based on that, not just by working with an institution up in the northeast of Scotland, but also I've done a lot of examining of PhDs, both nationally and internationally, and I feel, so there's a kind of closing down in the universities that is quite problematic.
Sorry, Jo, did that come through, that
Yes.
audio?
Yes, it did. But I don't think we need to hear the whole podcast.
No, sorry.
No. But I just know it was interesting to hear the beginning of that. Was Anne Douglas, who had done her PhD the earliest in '92, but I think you'd interviewed her in 2018, I think, hadn't you?
Yeah.
And yeah, so she's one of the doyens of creative practice-based research, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so moving into the realm of the theoretical framing, my PhD was about practice and my own practice and looking at other people's practice, and I ended up looking at practice theory, which I seem to think made sense, and it's a little bit, it's kind of based on Pierre Bourdieu and that sort of thing, but I found the work of Theodore Shatsky particularly useful, and Sophie was happy for me to suggest this as one of the ways that we were going to frame the findings, and this is because we talk about a social site of practice, so it's not just the things that you do, but it's also the other influencing factors, so the space and the resources and the relationships and the meanings and the emotions that you go through when you're becoming a practitioner. Could I have the next? Yeah. And so it means that you can look at a practice as bodily doings and sayings. So even thinking through what it is that we might be doing when we're actually logistically doing our research, and also thinking through. And then the other academic that we brought into this was Etienne Wenger, but early on his work was with Jean Lave, and between the two of them they came up with a very interesting book that is used a lot in education teaching, and their concept, legitimate peripheral participation, because that's, as we've said here, that's how newcomers are joining a practice. So they're becoming part of this community of practice. They're learning how to be specialist practitioners, and we felt that this was relevant as well for our PhD participants to see what it was that they were experiencing as they were trying to become this new type of practitioner. And again, it's all about the interactions and the relationships, and this was another quote that we took from a later piece of work from Wenger, and we've provided a lot of the references on these slides for you for later.
We also, in the process of writing up this paper, we found the work of Alice Lamb, which I'd not come across before. And Alice Lamb wrote about the experience of artists, creative practitioners who'd entered universities, and Alice was coming not from an arts background, so she was sort of approaching this with a disinterested take, I suppose, on I didn't really have a stake in how they were doing. So it was a really interesting read, the few papers that she wrote on this research based on interviews with people in these situations. Anyway, Alice came up with these three terms, these three types of people, that when I read it, I was like, good God, I'm a pracademic. What's happened to me? It was like somebody's come up with a term, and actually she does acknowledge that this isn't her term. She reference it has another life to it that she sort of appropriates in this paper. But so she talks about academic practitioners who are able to switch quite easily between roles. So one day they've got their academic hats on, and the next they've got their practitioner hats on. The pracademics are artists and practitioners who've entered the academy and made that quite conscious career transition. And then practitioners in academia are those who've joined academia late, and still see themselves primarily as practitioners. So this is how she sort of identified these categories according to the interview she did. And she notes that the work and the interface of two contradistinctive knowledge communities and their experience reveals the identity work undertaken to reconcile the tension. So Lamb is also, along with lots of other people that we were reading for this, prepared to prepare for this article, would talk a lot about the kind of the tensions, the unease, and the difficulties people have with these different identities, but that it was this pracademic, the artists in academia who'd made this transition, who were doing the most disruptive, what she calls boundary work, and they contest the established knowledge practices and hierarchies, and promoted alternative ways of knowing, because they are invested, I guess, career-wise as well in that, in being artists, creative practitioners in the academy. They are also doing, in her understanding of it, the most work to challenge existing knowledge practices. So she also draws on Homi Bhabha's work on the idea of hybridity and a third space, which we'll come back to, where cultural differences are encountered and negotiated. And also we wanted to sort of draw on what Jo was talking about with Wenger's work, that around boundary crossing and this sort of working in the margins, is that this I like this idea that on the one hand it can be really rich and like you can learn a lot being, you know, doing that boundary crossing, but it's also can be a complete waste of time. And I think that acknowledging that, you know, and you don't necessarily know it is until you're in it and you're doing it and thinking, what is the point of this? So this is something I guess also we're thinking about in terms of the interviews we've been doing and our experiences of what's happening in higher education more broadly, and the pressures on time and expectations and things like that. So yes, do I carry on here, Jo? Is this, yeah. So we also drew on Jen Webb's work on how artist academics attempt to conflate their two fields to make artwork count in and for the academy, and to a lesser extent transport academic products into the field of art. So this idea that you're continually switching codes as you move between these two home fields. What you gain in one field can be lost in the other. There are different expectations, languages even, and understandings of what you're doing in these two sometimes quite distinct fields. In terms of, also in terms of thinking in terms of infrastructures, funding, and things like that as well. Webb also takes Bourdieu's concept of field and habitus to explore how artists might feel like a fish out of water in an academic context. And this is something we also found in our interviews. But you can also feel out of place in art contexts when you develop this academic identity, once you've been through the PhD process, for example. And Kroll also refers to this as donning several masks in a university context. You might suffer from multiple personality disorder in a healthy way, and only the context determines which personalities have their say. Some of this may feel familiar to those in the room. We also wanted to share a few quotes from and references that we made in the article to the podcast to get some of the voices of the people we spoke to into this space. So Cara Davies talked about her experience and how at the time of when we were interviewing her, she did feel like an academic. And even though she'd graduated previously to couple of years previously, I think, to when I interviewed her. But the reality, she says, of trying to maintain an academic profile and keeping up with publishing, the pressure of going to conferences, but not having the funding or an institutional affiliation becomes a lot harder. So that big question, the elephant in the room, how do you continue to be an academic whilst not being in the academy? So especially when you might be in a similar situation to myself, where you're interdisciplinary, you're freelancing, you're working across different industries, something's got to give, she says. Lucy Wright, when we interviewed her in 2021, was talking about her experience as a precarious academic on multiple a series of fixed term contracts, academic contracts, after having done her PhD. So she said it's a kind of hustle, since you're always having to try and work out how to sell yourself the next time. She referred to how she might downplay her actual approach, as an artistic researcher in interviews, in the hope, she says, that I can squeeze it in on the side when I've actually got the job. But at the time, you try and be what they want you to be. And over to you, Jo. You were going to, I think, talk through.
So this, yeah, so Nina Perry is an established radio producer for the BBC. She does programmes, features for BBC Radio 3, BBC Radio 4, and she's a grown-up, you know, she's middle-aged, but decided that she wanted to do a PhD. And as she said to Sophie, she found herself in an odd place because she has her PhD, but she now qualifies as, you know, an early career researcher, so quite junior, on the periphery, you know, still learning, even though she's so established in her professional career. And her comment to us about resources and access was not just being paid by an institution to research, which is the ideal, but also having the framework of support that she really appreciates.
I should also say as well about Lucy on the previous slide that she, when we were interviewing her, you know, she'd recently made a conscious decision to no longer pursue precarious contracts in academia, in higher education, and went for a job in the arts and part-time to provide her with some security, but also enabled her to continue her practice as an artist.
Yes, and I don't believe, sorry, Nina from the previous slide, I don't think she's actually teaching and employed there, but they use her research in teaching, which is the connection. Yeah. So this was Libro Levi Bridgman interviewed, and they're very creative, theatrical, very active and productive. But as you can see from this quote, the original attempts to settle in academia, you know, some of us might not want the precarity, but actually being able to have the flexibility is something that Bridgman appreciates. So I guess it's horses for courses. But I think that they have so much confidence in what they're doing. And in fact, was this one of our participants who doesn't use the title doctor, if I'm right?
They were encouraged to take it out of their profile by their publisher that they had a PhD. Their online profile, yeah.
So, and then we had Anne Douglas and Rachel Han, who are very much established artists in academia. And Rachel has done quite a lot of work creating archives and shared online spaces for resources to try and create one of these bridging hybrid spaces. And we felt that their examples very much matched LAM's hybridization strategy. So it's this notion of brokering roles to facilitate interaction and knowledge co-creation between both academic and practitioner colleagues. So, yeah. And our findings, yeah, in terms of what we go through on the PhD journey, it's very disruptive, and you know we do experience, and all our interviewees said that they found the process quite disruptive. It changed them, changed the way they felt about their practice. But also there are still, as we discovered from our interviewees, some legitimacy issues as to the value of creative, artistic, practice-based research. And so that kind of ended up in us using the term rebellious, which is quite a coincidence because this is the name of this research series. So we're being rebellious at the same time as trying to somehow conform to the academic parameters that are set for us. And in terms of this creative practice-based research that we do, there does still seem to be this lack of fixity, what the expectations are, and where the contexts are, where these social sites of our practice is supposed to be, and where we belong in terms of our identity. And so very much this formative experience of the PhD process necessarily involves these identity crises, and a sort of reshaping of who we are as our different identities coalesce.
And it's maybe worthwhile saying that in the interviews, most people we interviewed didn't go about doing a PhD in order to enter academia. I think it was and that seems to be quite common with practice-based PhDs, people who go enter the PhD, start a PhD with a practice that they've been working on and developing for many years. It's not necessarily an intended outcome to go into academia, which might, which still seems quite odd in a way. So even if there were, so I'm just thinking there were many motivations and different approaches, weren't there? We talked to people about why they embarked on a PhD in the first place in the podcasts, as well as then what the experience of the PhD process was like, and then what happened next. So it had this sort of 3 parts to each interview. Sorry, go on, Jo.
Oh yeah. Yes, and we had some lovely quotes, didn't we, from people talking to us about how they felt at the end, obviously exhausted at the end of the PhD process. But Lizzie Lloyd was describing how much of a relief it was, and I think she was our participant who went off for 6 months doing something completely different, traveling or something. And Sunshine Wong felt very abandoned, actually. She described it as feeling left out in the wild, because done and dusted, got the doctor title, and then it was like, what was she supposed to do with it? No one kind of was there to sort of care about what she should do next. So we did find that the time and space that we kind of need for this readjustment isn't actually there, because it's not necessarily sustainable. And so we continue to negotiate as we progress, because it's a very specialised, we'd like to call it a community of practice, because that was one of the theories that we were trying to apply to this, but it seems very nebulous still.
And then again, just to sort of go back to this idea of boundary crossing, there was much boundary crossing on a regular basis post PhD, because they're out of necessity or desire, but this of course influenced everyone's sense of identity formation as they talked about it, and their and how fragmented that could be at times. The conversations also illuminated how difficult and unsatisfactory this boundary crossing can be, especially if there's no conceptual third space to develop that hybrid identity. As Jo was saying, you're sometimes, like Sunshine Wong was saying, you're left out in the wild to fend for yourself and think about what next. So there's plenty of, or not plenty, I would say what we were trying to understand is look into research that's being done on post PhD careers in general, and of course there is some on that, but there's not much on for the area that we're looking at, the creative practice side of things, and that maybe there is a need for these kind of third spaces post PhD to support structures, infrastructure that can provide that space for people to transition into something, although of course that is probably a lifetime's work. So this is difficult if you're feeling misunderstood in these different sectors that you're trying to work in. And yes, this idea of being both feeling like at one with your academic and practitioner self in sync seemed quite a rare thing in our interviews. And maybe that's okay, maybe that's fine, but it was causing some tension, I would say, for some. And so I guess something we want to kind of lead into the conversation with is this idea of creating a third space. And if there's any existing support structures that you know of, that you attend, that you organise, that are doing this. So our research highlights how there's more to be done collectively to hold that third space for developing hybridised work of the so-called practitioner academic, and that this community of practice is not yet fully formed, that belonging to a community that is better assured of its value to academia and non-academic sectors might enable practitioners to explore, flourish and produce new knowledge with less precarity. That's a big wish. Can we develop more ways for practitioner researchers post-PhD to share their career hopes and fears? And yeah, could this sort of space be a step towards this? And I think we've got a final quote, which I've pulled out from Lucy Lyons, who I found this really inspirational, and it feels like it keeps kind of coming back to me in different forms and shapes. So she said, if someone invites you to their party, and even if they seem a bit odd or outside your own practice, go, because that's where you're wanted. Go to your tribe, don't fight it, because you'll be far more comfortable and supported with them. And I thought that was wise words. So I thought I'd share that with you rather than as constantly trying to bang on doors that ain't going to open. So I will stop sharing my screen. I'm just going to put this up. These are some questions that we thought of having a discussion around, and maybe sort of just starting that off. Maybe, I don't know, Jo, do you think we should have some like Q&A time immediately now and then go into groups and then come back? So these are some of the questions we can put up in the chat around your own experiences of, if you feel like you've got multiple identities, how you're combining those in practice, or conceptually, how you're reconciling and applying your academic and creative practice to each other during and or after the PhD. What's missing in terms of support and training around this area, and what resources might help us with the transition to forming your post-PhD identities as researcher practitioners. And we've got on here a long list of references, which we will share with you. I don't think I can linger on those too much, can I? But I'm sure Agatha will share those around. I'm going to stop sharing. Have I stopped sharing? No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Amazing.
That was a lot of info.
Thank you so much. I have to say, I felt so incredible listening to both of you talk about it, because I became absolutely obsessed with this idea of creating a support system for practice research, practice-based researchers. And obviously what you're talking about is really about that. And obviously you're looking at the stage when people already have their PhDs and kind of don't really know how to really use it in a way which makes sense for their careers and identities and everything. So do you want to lead this Q&A first part of it with the questions you had on the slide, or should we just open for?
I think open it up, whatever people have to say, and then I think it would be nice if we can to go into breakouts, just so people can have a little bit of a time to share.
Shall I share those questions anyway in the chat?
I think they're really good. Yeah, so maybe we can open it up. But meantime, as we're waiting for this to pop on the screen, is there anyone in the room who has any immediate question following that? Because it was really fascinating.
Jeremy.
Hello. Thanks a lot for that. As you can see, I'm a bit old and grizzly, and obviously you're touching on something that's been quite relevant to my PhD journey. However, I'd like to add, and you kind of touched on it with Lucy Perry, but I'd like to add something else into the mix, because I've been working as an artist for 40 years, and then, you know, I did other qualifications, including an MSc, but, you know, doing a practice coming towards the end, I hope. I'm looking at Agatha because she's been sort of helping me with it. But I decided to use the PhD as a validation of my work. And that's caused quite a lot of confusion for universities and when I give papers, etc., because I have no interest in going into academia in that way. I'm happy to teach and happy to share, etc. But I was just wondering what, from your point of view and from your really interesting stuff, and I read it in the magazine in the first place, as to how that actually could fit in with what you're talking about. Because I think I'm not the only ones doing it like that.
Yeah, I mean, I know Anina actually did her PhD by publication, or by public output, it's sometimes called, isn't it? And that was because she was already working, as far as I can remember, in academia, but she hadn't got the PhD. So in a way, and I think that was also, there was a scheme that was set up for people who were in academia but kind of needed a PhD to continue working in there. I've examined a PhD by publication or by practice, by public output. So where you have a body, somebody has a huge body of work, and then it's sort of shaped into a PhD, which I've only examined one, so I'm still quite green in that sense, and I need to look at some more, because I did find it's quite hard, having read a lot of PhDs, to then read one that's by publication or by public output, and it has a much smaller word count. It's like, is it sort of 30? I think it was 30,000 words or something, maybe even less.
Oh no, mine's going to be about 40 or 50,000. But I've also got an encounter performance that I'm doing as well, which is going to be counted. So
yeah, you're not doing one of these practice PhDs by publication. But no. I think the idea of doing a PhD, you know, the motivation to do a PhD to validate is an interesting question, because often through PhDs we're kind of expected to question what we're doing to the extent where we're like, oh my god, I've really messed up, or, you know, potentially I've done something dreadful with my work. And then you've got to be open, and you know, the process is open enough to shift the ground that you're on to the extent where you might never do the same thing again, or you know, you change, you know, like I was saying in that snippet, you're like, you're a changed person through the process of that investigation. And it is often with practice we're doing a bit of self-investigation, because our practices are on a part of the things we're investigating.
Aye.
Does that make sense?
Well, I think you've opened up, I mean, I won't take any more time, but I think you have opened up another sort of field of inquiry which is going on, which could be quite interesting to explore in the future, which I think, well, no, I don't think, I know that Agatha has been thinking about as well. And it's certainly something that's waiting to be explored. And I'm not the one to do that, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, that's great. I will just say, though, I think, you know, Jeremy's saying that he's doing a PhD to validate his own work. I'm sure that you will have been locating it in the world. So you've been critically looking at your own work to try and make sense of it in the context of all other work in the same kind of.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, and there's for me, that's where the academic stuff is.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with you. Which is quite sometimes complicated and sometimes really simple.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good luck with it.
Thanks.
Good luck.
I'm gonna ask you a question, if that's okay, and then of course we're gonna invite more people to do it. So I've been personally really involved in the work around finding the legitimacy of practice research, and a kind of work about on this hybrid spaces and place in between, and making sure that we are recognized as a community that doesn't necessarily respond to one discipline, but it kind of sits in between the disciplines. And then what we do is very chaotic and messy sometimes, but it still is very rigorous in many ways. And what do you think is that we need to do as a community to really make sure that what we do is recognized across the board and consistent among higher education institutions, peer reviewers, founding bodies, examiners, and everyone involved? I know it's a difficult question, but it's been really something which I had on my mind for a very long time, and I really want to know how to do it. And I don't know if there's an easy answer for that, but what do you think is the recipe for that?
I mean, anyone could answer this, but I feel like it's obviously on multiple fronts that, and I think we have things have progressed and moved. You know, we need to acknowledge that the field is changing all the time, and there are more examples of practice research happening at PhD level and beyond, and is, you know, that we at Birkbeck had more. We had, for the first time, we had now what are they called? Not portfolios, but, you know, the ref sorry, my brain, I can't remember the name of the title of it. The portfolios that were basically presented as, you know, practice research that went into the ref. So the fact that's, I think, progress in a way. You've got a big institution that didn't have any practice in ref last time round, did this time, so that's good. It's being recognised in that institutional kind of way. And I think, like you're saying about peer review platforms that acknowledge that you can start putting alternative formats into sort of journals, and there are more journals, and, you know, that's exciting as well. And we're trying to sort of think through what that peer review process would mean if it's not in a written form or in an article shape. And then things like, you know, these sort of forums like the one you've set up, the Corkscrew one, there are other institutional ones. I think what would be great if we could set up kind of extra institutional ones or cross institutional ones, you know, so that aren't just tied to the IP of one organisation. And yeah, so I think there's multiple things happening. I think we just, you know, it is a bit like the that lovely quote of pushing at open doors, or you know, going to parties you've been invited to. That's a way, you know, they're you start to kind of talk about this stuff because there's some weird shared interest that you may not have even realised. But turning up to things also uninvited, but it sometimes is a bit easier if you've been invited.
I think didn't Rachel set up an archive space that's searchable practice-based artifacts?
Now, did she do that, or she's talking about doing it? We should find out, shouldn't we, and put a link, because there was definitely a move. She was talking about how to make more publicly available the exam. Like, obviously if you've done a PhD, you've got the PhD. That is the thing that exists. You know, it has to exist on the web, or, you know, in the university library. It's got a kind of trace. But for those of us post PhD, you're like, you've got the odd, you know, thing here and there, an article, an exhibition, a performance, but it's actually like, where do you go to, where's the you know, the holding bay for all of this stuff? So yes, I think she was doing that, wasn't she? A sort of database, developing.
I'll have a look, because we might have it somewhere.
That would be amazing if you could share it. That would be great. So can I just go back to the third question we have in the chat, because it links to the thing we're discussing right now. So obviously, yeah, I agree with you, Sophie, and obviously things are changing in a positive way, but I don't think we're still in a place where everyone's on the same page with what's going on, and that goes back to support and training. So what do you think collectively, again, as a community, we can do in terms of make this support and training even more effective? And perhaps more consistent, because effective it might be in some cases. I mean, I know you've helped me a lot with Corkscrew. It was just really so inspiring. It made me feel part of the community, and this is how I felt kind of supported in a way that even though what I was doing was very different, I knew I was part of a community which does things like that. But how can we make sure that this is consistent across the higher education institution in the UK and beyond, really? What do you think we can do?
Again, I think just doing it, just get on with it. I don't know. I don't think we can make it consistent, because that is, I think that again, that's for me a leap too far. But I feel it goes back to those ones, you know, the conversations you have at the metaphorical party. It's the kind of the involving people in the research process that you know, don't usually get involved in things like that, or having peer, you know, having informal exchanges. That's why I like the show and tell model, where you kind of, you get to experience somebody's work, you visit, you support each other in doing the work. And I think that's where we learn and grow. But I think there's also a bigger question and structural question, which is I find a bit it's hard to tackle, which is the exclusionary nature of, by Jeremy, of the PhD, and, you know, the gatekeeping, what am I trying, you know, like there's a lot of barriers and hurdles to get through if indeed you ever wanted to embark on a PhD in the first place, let alone get a job in academia or a job anywhere. So I think that, you know, like, how do we support people who don't have funding, who are not in an academic context or institutional context, who are but don't have the funding or resources or time to do the things they want to do. And I think that going back to that kind of rebellious neon sign that you've got, you know, like, how do we keep cracking open those spaces, sharing the resources if we have any, redistributing those to people who don't have the support structures as well.
So do you think it could be about creating a community which doesn't necessarily rely on this academic affiliations, just a community of people who work with creative practice research, regardless of where they work and what they do? Is that what you think might be useful?
Maybe, yeah, probably. I mean, I think that's what I quite enjoy about this, is that you end up, because when you're doing a PhD, it's so blooming specialised. It's hard. There's probably about 3 other people who know, you know, in detail the thing that you know about. So I think we're going to have, you know, realistically, it's about connecting up with people sort of beyond your knowledge area of expertise and things. And I think that's exciting. Like, that's what I loved about the learning from other people's research and delving into that a little bit more with the podcast, is that you get to find out about things like you know, Lucy's illustrations of anatomy and things like that, and you sort of start to learn a bit more about her process and her way of thinking through illustration, and you sort of enter these other worlds. And I think that's what personally I get a lot out of. But it's, you know, we have to sort of also figure out what's most useful for us at a certain time, and maybe there's, you know, a need for more special, like I've got a little group I'm involved in, and we're, you know, our Venn diagram crossovers are very niche. So, you know, we're all practice-based researchers, we're working in academia, and we are all doing socially engaged practice. So we've kind of got, there's in the middle of that Venn diagram, that's our sort of overlap, and that helps us because we have got very specific questions and needs and things to talk about. But maybe there's also scope for broader networks. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Tim has already disappeared. It would be nice to actually hear are you still with us, Tim? No, I think he's gone, because it would be nice to hear based on what he's doing, actually. So we have another comment about Zina Head's book, Lost in Thought, The Hidden Pleasure of the Intellectual Life, is very relevant to this way of thinking about work at the fringes of academia. I mean, what I like about your work, really, because I am very much concerned about creating a support system, and that's what I'm interested in. But what I really like about your project here specifically is about, all right, well, you have a PhD, now what can you actually do with it? How is it even helpful? And what is this question of your identity? And I kind of work in the same area, but up to the stage of you, or perhaps for people who are part of academia and doing practice as form of research, whether as PhD students or kind of academics who are doing their PhDs. But I don't really look that much into this area as well. While you have a PhD, you might not actually work in academia. So do you think we can, what do you think would be a value, apart from what we've heard from Jess, of having a PhD in creative practice, but not being, again, part of the academic world, because it works slightly differently, because you don't have access to many things if you're not affiliated with a higher education institution. That's the hard truth of it. And it doesn't mean that it's the right or wrong way to be or not be affiliated. But what do you think are the benefits of having a PhD and not really worrying about being part of academia?
Well, a lot of people said that it helped them articulate what it was that they were doing with their professional, creative, artistic practice better. And it somehow did give them more confidence in their creative abilities. I mean, one of the Olamide Popula is a creative writer, and she's just doing her own workshop series. So I would imagine, like her, there must be some people who are able to use the social capital of the doctoral title, and maybe it helps them win funding from community funds or arts funds to actually do the sorts of projects that perhaps you'd never be able to do in a university anyway, on your own agenda, but funded from some arts fund or lottery fund or whatever. So I think it can be leveraged, and it, like I said, quoting Bourdieu again, it gives you the social capital, it gives you the label.
And it was also very interesting when you were talking about Nina's case, when she was obviously a very accomplished practitioner and very well established, but yet when she started with her PhD, she was placed in this category of what you said, Sophie, was an early career researcher. And how do you deal with this kind of thing when you're really accomplished and really well established in your practice, and yet you're considered to be an early career researcher because you just finished your PhD? How can we reconcile that?
I think that's character building, because it makes you feel very humble, when actually there's a lot of stuff that you don't understand. There's maybe some academic jargon you don't understand. There are processes, academic, structures, protocols. So, it must be a good, positive learning experience, but it can be quite painful, and you have to go through it.
But of course, we also have a case of many academics who are, like Nina, really established in their fields, and they work in academia, but they don't necessarily have a PhD. And of course, many institutions will push you towards getting one.
Well, that's because you can go in. I mean, this is why I did my PhD before I attempted to get a job, because I knew that if I went in just to teach people how to use a radio production desk or how to do news, like just teaching the practical skills, I knew that I would be then told to go off and do a PhD, because you need to get some theoretical undergirding behind this practical teaching that we want you to do. Yeah, because you apparently in education you can't just teach people the hands-on stuff. You have to teach them all the all the academic, intellectual, problematizing everything that goes on.
I'm going to ask you, I'm sorry, because I'm taking over all the Q&As, and I really will open it to everyone else who's still here. But I'm kind of interested to see, because one of the things I'm really interested in is to actually look at the practices of dissemination. So obviously, if you're a practitioner in a pure form, if you like, not necessarily working within academia, sometimes your dissemination strategies are slightly different to the academic ones, because let's say you're a filmmaker, you'll be sending your films to to film festivals and places like that, or you will be working in your own relevant industry. Whereas when you work within academia and you treat your practice as research, then you will be considering other venues as well. So of course there are journals or places or online places where you can submit your practice for peer review. And as you said, Sophie, there's obviously it's getting slightly better, even though I think it's far from perfect, and we still don't have enough places to really have a showcase of our practice research, but it is getting better. what do you think about this? Because in my opinion, depending on where you disseminate your work, you will obviously have a different set of expectations. It's almost like what we talk about disciplines. So each disciplines will have their own its own respective expectations, but the same applies to forms of dissemination. And it was really painful for me to see when I was doing my PhD and I was chasing the same films in different contexts. So, for example, depending whether they were shown at indigenous film festivals, ethnographic film festivals, or mainstream film festivals, the reception was very different because the profile of the festival was very different and the audiences had different expectations. But if we talk about differences between publishing your work, your film, for example, in the academic journal, which takes practice research, and peer reviews that, and a film festival, again, very often you might have a very different responses. So again, how can we manage this in a way which is effective and which doesn't necessarily influence our identity? Because we talked about identities quite a lot today in a negative way, because I think it's quite important.
I'm not sure if it'll address this, but the I was thinking about who the peers are in the peer review process with the work that we do, and often I mean, again, I'm generalizing massively, but in my experience of publishing articles in peer-reviewed journals, which seem to be on the top of the hierarchy of what counts in academia, in terms of promotions and ref and what have you, that the peers are other people with PhDs who work in academia and can afford to work for free, or work as, you know, to fit it into a kind of ridiculous workload schedule that you know, reviewing papers doesn't seem to figure in. So you're in a kind of weird old scenario where that is completely normalized. But for us, for many of us working in practice-based research, our peers are not people with PhDs. They're not like people necessarily with an understanding of the research context of higher education, but they are experts in the thing that you're doing with them, or, you know, alongside them, or in that context. So I think it kind of be interesting. I mean, I know that's probably too rebellious or radical to even consider questioning who the peer is in the peer review process, but I feel like that's something I'm excited about doing, because I kind of have more respect sometimes, and I would love to hear more from peers on projects that I work on about what they make, and actually to find space to really critically think, like, what is this? How is it coming across? What, you know, what is this? It's the best method of dissemination. And I think a lot of that kind of questioning that you have in a supervisory context on a PhD, I've never really had that again, apart from, you know, one time when, you know, colleagues have very kindly looked at a book proposal. But, you know, there's a sort of lack of informal peer review before the, you know, scary peer review, I find, in general after the PhD. So but people might have other experiences, you know, more positive experiences of that.
Do you have anything to add, Jo?
Unfortunately, you cannot get away from this multiplicity, which is a good word, and plurality, and dare I say, postmodernist situation that we find ourselves in, because there's almost just like this, you know, there are too many trajectories that we go in. Say if we have left academia and we're using our newfound intellectual skills just to continue to perfect our artistic or creative practice, and we're going on and we're trying to do that, then I feel like we're moving further away from what might have been the hybrid space, which might be quite close to the academic course. If you see it like a sort of concentric circles, I feel like we're just disappearing off into some massive galaxy of, you know, creative wonder. Yeah. And it's just hard to grab and turn that into fixed connections.
I think the comment I would have for this is really interesting. And I promise after my comment, I will open for more questions from the public. But I just find it so interesting what you're saying. But what I realized in my case, because I was really, really heavily based in my practice when I was doing my PhD and before for many, 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 many years. And the moment I landed my job in academia, my practice just basically disappeared. So even though all I'm doing in terms of my research is conceptualizing practice research, I actually stopped doing practice because of the time constraints, because I'm writing, because I'm organizing things to do with practice research, because obviously you have all the other things you do when you work full-time in academia. And I find it really, really frustrating because I start to feel like it's really not right. I've been doing practice of, doing all the things to do with film and photography all my life, since I was 13 or maybe even less. And then the moment I work in academia, I just stop, and I find it's really highly frustrating. And I know it's not everyone's case, because there are people who manage to successfully continue both, but it's definitely not my case. And I think the more I'm involved in creating or trying to create this kind of support system for practice research, which is really doing exactly what both of you are doing, the further away it takes me from my practice. And I almost see myself in X amount of time just moving away from academia so I can go back to my practice. And I really find it very difficult to reconcile. I don't know if you have anything to comment on that or give me some kind of advice, but I find it very strange because, and I recognize it, it's funny enough, I recognize it with the work I was doing when I was doing my PhD, where my contributor was working very hard to protect his indigenous community in Colombia. And in order to do so, he had to abandon his indigenous lifestyle and learned how to use the cameras and live in the cities and just do all these kind of things in order to protect something he really cared about. And I think I feel exactly like that right now. I kind of had to stop doing everything to just support something I no longer engage with. So I don't know if you have any advice or comments.
Maybe that is, I'm thinking about Lamb's the categories of pracademic, artist, I can't remember all the different terms now. But I'm wondering if, rather than like thinking of ourselves as one or another of those, it's almost thinking about it more as a cycle, like a life cycle. Or so thinking like you're at the moment like fighting the good fight for practice research in the academy. But maybe that is time limited. Maybe you go, these next 3 years, I am doing that. I'll try, these are my targets. This is what I'll try and get changed.
Yeah.
But then the next 3 years, I'm going to go into my practice hat goes on. And I think because we can't be multiple things to everyone all the time, but acknowledging that we have these cycles, and if we can plan for them and be realistic about what energy they take, that they, there is a rhythm to it. And also, depending on the practice, probably a timeline in terms of how long it takes to make a film, or how long it takes to get funding and then to get everyone paid properly. And there's a sort of practical considerations as to how that rhythm feels and looks like. But I wonder if, life doesn't have to be one thing, and forevermore. And often, we things happen we don't plan for, but that might be a way of feeling a bit more.
And funny enough, when you were saying that, Sophie, I was thinking about how, when I talk to people about how to plan for a practice research project and how to reconcile academic rigor and this kind of creative chaos and messiness, I always talk about the same. I talk about, well, you just give yourself some time for the creative chaos. When you don't worry about anything else, just improvise and experiment. And then that following that, you're going to have a process of perhaps some kind of reflective moment when you're just going to evaluate it. And then maybe the following step will be more about like looking at contexts and practices and theories. And then kind of the cycle continues. So you actually very nicely pointed me back to what I'm talking about quite a lot. And obviously don't apply to myself, so it's quite interesting. Right, how about someone else from the, because I just found it so incredible fascinating, so I'm so sorry I've taken over the last half an hour of these questions and answers. So we have Simon King saying, excellent, thank you Sophie, Joe and Agata. I have to take my leave. This has been so illuminating and useful with implications for my practical research in relation to methodology, for example, abductive reasoning and self-reflective subjectivity. Shad sees read the social side of practice and Wenger legitimate peripheral participation look crucial sources. So that's amazing. Thank you, Simon. That's really great. Is there anyone in the room who has a question? No, it doesn't look like. Yeah.
We were going to do little groups, but I'm wondering if it's quite a small amount of people. We've only got 10 minutes, so it's probably worth sticking in this group, isn't it?
It might be.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if it's a question, maybe just something that came to my mind. Yeah, it's a wonderful conversation. Something that always came to my mind when talk about practice-based research and PhD is if you think about the history of artistic practice, and it's very, very old actually, the idea of research and artistic practice. It's not something that was born with academia. Thousands of artists using research in a very rigorous way and changing completely the directions of their practice, and and that's something sometimes, I don't know, I feel that's in some way the academia is almost like taking that for granted, like absorbing this as a kind of, what I'm trying to say is research and artistic practice is not something new. And as an artist and researcher, you can maybe have more confidence. And it is I'm trying to do, but of course I'm having the same crisis at the moment. So just leaving my practice away to do my PhD and have this conflict when I'm going to come back or never, I don't know. But I think this confidence that research in artistic practice is not something new, and how can you, open more these cracks in space inside the institution to or really get more confidence as a researchers that there's a huge legacy behind us, doing very interesting research outside academia, much before that. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, or I don't know, any comments. It's not a question, it's just, yeah, some reflection.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's of course, really important point. And I think we talk, a bit about the institutionalization, academicization of practice for all sorts of reasons, for validation, for, to keep our jobs, to challenge, the academy. So there's all sorts of motives for framing one's practice, which is already research-based, in the context of a PhD or academic work. But I think I'm trying to remember now, the context I heard this in, but it, like how often with obviously you get artists who have research as part of their practice, but then as I understood it and what happened to me is that the sort of revelation of the PhD is that of course that is it's not just about my own self-growth as a practitioner that I'm researching and I'm interested in. It's like, how am I applying and thinking through my practice to develop some kind of understanding or new knowledge that's relevant to people beyond me and my practice. So I think that's sort of given, isn't it? And that's why you understand that doing a PhD. But I think sometimes that's why I think when I pre-PhD I called what I did action research without really kind of truly really understanding what that was. And then doing the PhD, I got a bit more of a sense of what that might mean, but also how difficult that is within the university context. That's not necessarily the place to do action research either. So yes, really interesting, kind of mixture of self-exploration and like soul searching through the PhD, but also thinking, what the hell have I got to say that's relevant and useful for the world?
Yeah,
which isn't always obvious, is it? But I think you're forced into framing it in that way, in a way that you perhaps aren't, or I hadn't been, having not done a PhD. But I don't think you should always have. It's like also thinking, I think some people in our interviews are talking about, sometimes it's okay for, just because you've done a PhD doesn't mean that thereafter everything you do is research. It's completely fine for some of the stuff you do to not be research. But it's like clarifying and determining what is and why some of it continues to be research.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I think it's
Oh,
mute.
Joel muted.
I was behaving myself and being quiet. I remember during my PhD, I had to put up a note to myself in front of me that said, "So what?" ? Because it couldn't all be about me and my research and what my little features meant to me and how I was, doing my practice, what my doings and sayings were that made me a practitioner. I realized that I had to be doing something that was much more meaningful, like Sophie said, to everybody else. What was my contribution to new knowledge, to new ways of practicing, and to the field that I was researching in? So what?
Yeah.
Just given me an idea for my new neon self, Joe.
You could put an exclamation mark after that, couldn't you? So what?
Good question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or leave space for someone else. Thank you for those comments.
So have we destroyed your idea of the breakout room? We still have 5 minutes if there's a way we can do it with the people who are remaining in the room. Oh, you muted, Sophie.
I feel like most people have gone now, but I don't know if there's a show of, if people are really want to go into a breakout room, then make it be known.
We could probably do this in this room. I don't think we have enough people to actually divide everyone. I think we had 20 people, and then somehow it looks like it's busy. It's a busy day for everyone today for whatever reason. But if you feel like we can use the next 5 minutes for a discussion.
Or just people could just contribute in the. Oh, Erin has a comment.
I'm a new researcher, so I've just started. So I just wanted to say thank you, because everything that I'm stressed about and struggling with, and I feel like I'm alone in, because I'm in a huge university, but a very small arts program. It's nice to know that I'm not alone in all of this, kind of the self-doubts of being an artist for 20 years and now coming into PhD and struggling with, well, why do I have to be one or the other? And why can't I just be both? And why is what I've done previously discounted? And kind of, yeah, so it's just, this has been really helpful in knowing that it's not just me in the struggle. So so thank you for that. And because I'm starting to figure out how to do this interview, so the resources and the things that you noted in the beginning are super helpful of how to start to formulate that jargon, that syntax that we're supposed to be using that's new. So I just want to say thanks. This was very affirming and comforting in a way, even though it's about what we're struggling with as we're doing. So thank you.
Great.
That's such an amazing comment, Erin. I just wanted to say that when I speak to people I sometimes help with, my colleagues at the university who are established and they just want to do a PhD, even though they've been in academia for many years, this idea of just being part of the community, even though what you might be doing, what you're doing is probably completely different from what everyone else is doing. But what we have in common is that we follow this path of creative practice, even though in many cases, you will be creating your own methodologies and you will be doing things in a completely different way. But there are other people who are struggling with the same kind of questions that has been just so helpful. And I think and that's why I'm so grateful to Sophie for a corkscrew, as I said before, because it was just so amazing to know that there are other people struggling with the same kind of questions. It's just, even though you might not necessarily get the answer of how to deal with your own specific project, just knowing that it is part of the process of being confused sometimes, and perhaps just finding your way in a creative way, and what you're doing might be very different. It's just so helpful. So kind of being part of community is a big way of supporting us as practice researchers, I think. So great comment. Yeah, thank you so much, Sophie, for adding the link. So obviously all of this is recorded at the moment, and I will, when I send an email to all the participants and everyone else, I will include the link to the network as well. So thank you so very much. It was just so wonderful to talk to the two of you. It's just really really great to have this kind of conversation, and lots of really exciting ideas, lots of things we should all consider and think about. So I'm very, very grateful for you, both of you, to join today. I'm just gonna, for the last 20 seconds, gonna share my screen again, just to tell everyone what is happening next month. So this is what's happening next month. I'm not gonna go to full screen mode, but it's the next session will happen on the last Wednesday of next month, which is 26th of April at the same time. And we have Craig Batty from the University of South Australia, who's going to be talking about contributing to knowledge through creative practice, a screenwriting case study. So that's what's awaiting us next month. And of course, what I'm going to do, hopefully later on today or tomorrow, I'll share this recording online for everyone else who wasn't able to join today, and I'll share the link to Corkscrew. And hopefully this conversation will continue, and we're going to keep building the community. So thank you so very much, Sophie and Joe. It was absolutely wonderful to have you here today. All the very best with all the things you're doing, and thank you to all the participants. Have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for having us.
Everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.